In 1962, the fiercely independent Murphy Radio Factory in Welwyn Garden City lost its voice. The company that had defined no-nonsense British engineering was swallowed by the rank organization and forcibly merged with its greatest high-street rival, Bush Radio. The consequences were absolute. The exclusive network of vetted local Murphy dealers, men who had built neighborhood trust over decades, found their unique status erased. The uncompromising, modernist wooden cabinets were phased out. The Welwyn Garden City engineers lost their autonomy, and the distinct Murphy production lines were systematically dismantled. The paradox is that just a decade earlier, the Murphy badge had meant precisely the opposite. It was a guarantee of elite reception and high-street exclusivity. A wireless set you simply could not buy in just any shop. Yet by the end of the decade, that once revered name was reduced to a plastic label glued onto mass-produced electronics. But the real story of Murphy is not merely a tale of corporate takeover. It is the story of what happened when the honest engineering of a British radio collided with the ruthless logic of retail consolidation. Every week, we tell the stories of the British wireless makers, high-street shops, and listening habits that once shaped how Britain heard the world, and what happened when the market moved on. Subscribe if that history matters to you. The story begins not with nostalgia, but in Welwyn Garden City in 1929. By 1929, the British wireless set, an older British term for a radio receiver that brings broadcast signals into the home without a physical program source, was suffering from a crisis of identity. The BBC had established its national authority. Savoy Hill was broadcasting daily. The signals from the Daventry transmitter were reaching across the home counties and beyond. Yet, the physical machines tasked with catching those voices were deeply compromised by the way they were sold, built, and styled. In the late 1920s, a British family looking to buy a mains radio faced a chaotic retail landscape. Radios were frequently sold by bicycle repairmen, local ironmongers, or general hardware merchants who possessed little to no understanding of the delicate electrical circuits inside the wooden box. When a tuning capacitor, a component that changes the circuit's tuning so the radio can select one station from many, failed or a glass valve burned out, the shopkeeper simply shrugged. Furthermore, manufacturers were hiding their crude engineering inside heavily ornamented cabinets designed to look like Tudor sideboards or Jacobean relics. They were selling pseudo-antique furniture that happened to make a noise. The British listener lacked a machine built primarily as a scientific instrument, and they lacked a reliable place on the high street to buy and maintain it. In Welwyn Garden City, Hertfordshire, two former post office engineers decided this system was fundamentally dishonest. Frank Murphy and E.J. Power believed that a valve radio, a radio that uses glass electronic valves to amplify and process signals before the transistor era, should not pretend to be an antique. It was a modern electrical machine, and it should be built, sold, and serviced with total engineering integrity. In the summer of 1929, they founded Murphy Radio. They rented a modest factory space on Broadwater Road in Welwyn Garden City, beginning with fewer than a dozen employees. Their philosophy was distilled into a single aggressive public slogan: less nonsense. Frank Murphy was a brilliant engineer, but an unorthodox businessman. He detested the industry standard of launching dozens of confusing models every year just to fill catalog pages. He believed in making a few highly engineered sets, testing them relentlessly on the factory floor, and selling them at a fixed price. The early models, such as the Murphy A3 launched in 1931, reflected this stark philosophy. Priced at roughly $17, a sum equivalent to over a month's wages for a skilled industrial worker at the time, It was not a cheap household appliance, but it offered remarkable stability on the medium wave, a broadcast band historically used for many domestic radio services. The tuning dial, the scale or display that shows which station or frequency the radio is tuned to, was clear and unadorned. There were no fake wooden flourishes. The controls were tactile and precise. The chassis inside was heavy, logical, and built to survive years of daily heat and voltage stress. But the most radical innovation of Murphy Radio did not happen on the assembly line in Welwyn Garden City. It happened on the British High Street. Frank Murphy recognized that a beautifully engineered radio could still fail if the channel that sold it lost faith, or worse, if the seller could not repair it. Therefore, Murphy Radio refused to sell its products through standard electrical wholesalers. They bypassed the traditional distribution networks entirely. Instead, they created the Murphy Dealer. To sell a Murphy Radio, a high street shop owner had to apply directly to the company. The vetting process was notoriously strict. The shop could not be a general merchant. It had to possess a dedicated service counter. It had to employ a qualified wireless engineer capable of reading a circuit diagram, testing voltages, and wielding a soldering iron. The dealer had to promise to maintain a high standard of window display, and they were strictly forbidden from discounting the fixed retail price. If a shop met these demands, they were granted the exclusive right to sell Murphy sets in their local postcode. This created a powerful geographical monopoly for the chosen retailer. In return, the British public quickly learned a new retail truth. You could not buy a Murphy wireless set just anywhere. You had to cross the threshold of an authorized Murphy dealer. This strategy transformed the act of buying a radio. It was no longer a blind gamble. When a customer walked into a vetted shop in Birmingham, Manchester, or a London suburb, they saw the distinctive Murphy sign in the window. They knew the proprietor understood the machine. If the aerial, a wire, rod, or internal component that receives radio waves from the air, needed adjustment, or if the loudspeaker developed a rattle, the man who sold the set would fix it on the premises. By the mid-1930s, this closed ecosystem had turned Welwyn Garden City into a powerhouse of British electronics. The Broadwater Road factory expanded rapidly, eventually employing hundreds of local workers to meet the demand generated by their exclusive dealer network. The trade press took notice. Magazines like Wireless World and Practical Wireless frequently praised Murphy chassis designs for their logical layout and accessibility, noting that the company clearly designed its radios with the service engineer in mind. The brand became synonymous with middle-class reliability. A Murphy set in the sitting room signaled that the household valued substance over flashy decoration. Frank Murphy himself became a public figure, writing highly opinionated, idiosyncratic newspaper advertisements that spoke directly to the consumer, explaining the technical reasons why his radios cost what they did. He refused to patronize the British listener. In 1937, Frank Murphy's uncompromising nature led to a fundamental clash with his board of directors, resulting in his departure from the company he founded. But the machine he built was already self-sustaining. Under the steady leadership of E.J. Power, Murphy Radio continued to grow. The foundation was set. Welwyn Garden City had the factory. The High Street had the dealers. The British sitting room was ready for a design revolution. And to achieve that, Murphy Radio was about to completely reinvent the shape of the wooden cabinet. By the mid-1930s, placing a Murphy wireless set in a British sitting room, the main reception room of a house where families gathered around the fire, was a deliberate aesthetic and technical choice. At the time, the wider British radio market was obsessed with camouflage. Competitors were still hiding their electronics inside heavily carved, dark wood cabinets adorned with intricate cloth grills and fake Jacobean flourishes. Welwyn Garden City chose a different path. They chose severe, uncompromising modernism. The breakthrough for Murphy Radio was not just a single successful product, but an entire engineering philosophy made physical, perfectly embodied in highly regarded sets like the Murphy A40. The cabinet, the wooden or plastic body that holds the radio's components and shapes its appearance, was a statement of intent. Frank Murphy and his successors hired brilliant industrial designers like Eden Minns and Gordon Russell. These men understood that a radio receiver, a device that selects a broadcast signal from the air and turns it into sound, was a modern electrical machine, not a piece of heritage furniture. They systematically stripped away the decorative fretwork. They utilized flat, high-quality walnut veneers. They pushed the tuning dial, the scale or display that shows which station or frequency the radio is tuned to, front and center. This visual honesty was matched by the heavy, reliable machinery inside. Murphy engineers fully embraced the super heterodyne circuit, an advanced receiver design that mixes the incoming broadcast signal with a locally generated frequency to dramatically improve a set's focus. As the European airwaves grew increasingly crowded with signals from the continent, selectivity, how well a radio separates one station from nearby stations, became a vital metric for the British listener. When a hand turned the heavy, weighted knob of a Murphy set, it engaged a precision tuning capacitor, a component that changes the circuit's tuning so the radio can select one station from many. The physical action felt deliberate. It did not slip. It did not drift. But the true engineering leap was acoustic. The Welwyn Garden City team refused to compromise on sound quality merely to fit the chassis into a smaller box. They pioneered the use of the baffle board, a large, flat wooden panel surrounding the speaker that prevents sound waves from the back of the cone from immediately canceling out those from the front, thereby creating a richer, deeper tone. Because of this acoustic space, the loudspeaker, the part of a radio that turns the electrical signal into sound moving through air, could reproduce voices with startling clarity. When tuned to the Droitwich transmitter on long wave, a lower frequency broadcast band used for long-distance national radio reception, a Murphy set filled the room. The BBC national program sounded authoritative. The music possessed bass and warmth. The heavy glass valves, glass electronic devices used to control and amplify signals before transistors replaced them, glowed steadily inside a well-ventilated chassis that was specifically designed not to overheat during hours of continuous evening use. This level of honest, over-engineered construction was not cheap. A mid-1930s Murphy mains radio, a set powered directly from the household electrical supply rather than batteries, frequently cost around $15. In an era when a skilled British factory worker might earn $3 or $4 a week, this was a major domestic investment. But the British radio moat, the protective barrier that kept Murphy highly profitable and insulated from cheap competition, was the absolute, unwavering trust of the high street. Because a Murphy set could only be purchased through an authorized Murphy dealer, the customer was not merely buying a box of wires, they were buying an ecosystem of guaranteed reception. When a family in a London suburb or a Birmingham terraced house saved up to buy a Murphy A40, the transaction did not end at the shop till the local dealer physically delivered the heavy set. The dealer installed the aerial, a wire, rod, or internal component that receives radio waves from the air, stretching it across the garden or the loft to ensure the best possible signal catch. The dealer demonstrated the controls. If interference, unwanted noise, or disturbance added to the signal ruined an evening broadcast, the family did not have to write a letter to a faceless factory. They simply walked back to the high street shop, and the dealer came back to fix it. This closed loop of quality control won over the most cynical and demanding observers in the country. Wireless World magazine frequently held up Murphy chassis layouts as benchmarks of logical construction. The readers of Practical Wireless and local radio clubs deeply respected the brand. For the high street service engineers, the men who actually had to repair these machines when a component eventually failed, a Murphy radio was a revelation. It was a pleasure to place on the repair bench. The wiring was neat. The components were logically arranged. The service manuals provided by Welwyn Garden City were exhaustively detailed. It was logical. It was accessible. It was built to survive. By the late 1930s, the Welwyn Garden City Company had proven a crucial retail truth. The British public would gladly pay a premium for a machine that did not lie to them. They did not need fake antique carvings if the sound was pure. They did not need constant discounts if the local shop guaranteed the repair. The badge on the dial was not decoration. It was a promise about reception. By 1939, the Broadwater Road factory in Welwyn Garden City was no longer a modest startup space. It had expanded into a massive industrial complex, a temple to British electronic engineering. But the true test of Murphy's no-nonsense philosophy arrived when the domestic market abruptly halted. With the outbreak of the Second World War, the production of elegant wooden cabinets for the sitting room was suspended. The factory lines were entirely repurposed for the war effort, and the uncompromising standards that Frank Murphy and E.J. Power had instilled were suddenly applied to national survival. During the conflict, the British military required wireless equipment that could survive the most brutal conditions on Earth. They did not need a radio to look good. They needed it to never fail. The engineers at Welwyn Garden City answered this demand with the same logical, heavy-duty design language they had applied to the high street, but scaled up for global warfare. This era of military production laid the groundwork for what would become one of the most legendary pieces of British radio engineering ever manufactured: the Murphy B-40 naval receiver. The B-40 was a communications receiver, a highly sensitive, multi-band radio designed for intercepting and maintaining vital military and maritime traffic across vast distances, particularly on shortwave, a broadcast band that can carry signals over continents and oceans. It was commissioned by the Royal Navy, and it was built like a battleship. Housed in a massive solid cast alloy casing, the B-40 weighed over 100 pounds. It was designed to withstand the physical shock of a naval gun firing on a warship deck, the concussive force of nearby depth charges, and the corrosive damp of the North Atlantic. Inside the heavy metal case, the valve circuits, the glass electronic devices processing the faint signals from the aerial, were isolated and cushioned. The tuning dial was geared with the precision of a Swiss watch, allowing a naval operator to lock onto a faint Morse code transmission with absolute stability. If a component failed at sea, the chassis was designed to drop out smoothly, so a technician could replace a valve or a capacitor, a component that stores and releases electrical energy in a circuit, in a matter of minutes. The B-40 was the ultimate manifestation of Murphy's core identity. It was ugly, it was heavy, and it was indestructible. When peacetime returned, the Welwyn Garden City factory shifted back to the domestic market with immense prestige. The British public, exhausted by wartime austerity, was hungry for entertainment, and the BBC Home Service and the newly launched Light program, a lighter, entertainment-focused national broadcast, were the background noises of recovery. Murphy Radio entered the late 1940s and early 1950s with thousands of employees and a sprawling manufacturing campus. They resumed their partnership with brilliant cabinet designers, pushing the boundaries of domestic aesthetics even further. This was the era of the great Murphy baffle sets. Models like the Murphy A146C console radio took the baffleboard concept, a large, flat wooden panel surrounding the loudspeaker that prevents sound waves from canceling each other out, and turned it into a striking piece of modernist furniture. These radios did not look like boxes. They looked like sleek, polished wooden shields standing on the floor, with the loudspeaker, the part of a radio that turns the electrical signal into sound moving through air, mounted proudly in the upper half. They were visually daring, acoustically superior, and heavily built. By the dawn of the 1950s, Murphy was not just manufacturing radios, they were producing radiograms, pieces of furniture combining a radio, amplifier, loudspeaker, and record player in one cabinet, and early heavy chassis television sets. The Welwyn Garden City plant was outputting tens of thousands of units annually, each one rigorously tested before it was allowed to leave the loading bay. But this massive industrial output was still strictly controlled by the company's defining retail mechanism. Despite the soaring national demand, a customer still could not buy a Murphy set from a department store catalog or a generic electrical wholesaler. The closed ecosystem of the local high street remained the iron fortress protecting the brand's reputation. To truly understand the scale of Murphy's dominance in the post-war era, one must look at the British high street. By the mid-1950s, the Murphy dealer network had become an ironclad institution. Industry estimates suggest that thousands of carefully vetted independent electrical shops proudly displayed the Murphy sign in their windows, from Glasgow down to the coastal towns of Sussex. For a local shopkeeper, holding the Murphy franchise was akin to holding a license to print money. But it required absolute obedience to Welwyn Garden City's standards. The dealer was forced to maintain a pristine showroom. They had to employ a skilled service engineer, a technician capable of repairing complex valve circuits on a dedicated service bench at the back of the shop. They were strictly forbidden from undercutting the national catalog price. In return, they faced zero local competition for the brand. If a customer in a specific postcode wanted a Murphy set, they had only one door they could walk through. This system created an incredibly deep bond of trust between the British listener and the manufacturer. When the BBC began rolling out VHF FFM, a radio band that gives clearer sound over shorter distances than older AM bands, the British public needed entirely new receivers to capture it. The transition was technically complex and expensive, but because the local Murphy dealer explained the technology, demonstrated the superior audio clarity, and guaranteed the after-sales service, buyers willingly paid the premium. Murphy engineers responded to the FM era by producing some of the most acoustically magnificent table radios, radios designed to sit on furniture rather than be carried in a pocket, ever built in Britain. They continued to reject fake historical styling. Instead, the cabinets featured clean, sweeping lines of bent plywood, rich walnut veneers, and highly legible glass tuning scales. The internal chassis remained heavy, logical, and unapologetically over-engineered. By the late 1950s, the Welwyn Garden City campus was at its absolute zenith. The factory floor was a sprawling, highly organized city of British labor, employing thousands of men and women. They were winding their own transformers, pressing their own metal chassis, and testing every single printed circuit board, a board carrying electronic components and copper tracks that connect them, before it was allowed to be seated into a wooden cabinet. The product line had expanded to include magnificent radiograms, a piece of furniture combining a radio, amplifier, loudspeaker, and record player in one cabinet. These large, imposing units became the ultimate status symbol for the British middle class. A Murphy radiogram occupying the corner of a sitting room in Bristol, Manchester, or Oxford was a declaration of domestic arrival. It provided the booming, clear audio required for evening entertainment, perfectly rendering the crisp pronunciation of a BBC newsreader or the rich bass of a classical music broadcast. At this moment, Murphy Radio was operating in perfect, unbroken alignment with the British market. Welwyn Garden City built the uncompromising machine. The local high street dealer sold and protected the machine. The BBC provided the voices that gave the machine its purpose. A Murphy radio sitting on a polished sideboard in 1958 was not just an electrical appliance catching signals from the air. It was a physical manifestation of a trusted British system. A system where engineering honesty was valued above cheap convenience, where a broken part was expertly repaired rather than mindlessly thrown away, and where the name on the badge meant exactly what it promised. It was a beautiful, profitable, and highly civilized way to build and sell radios. But it was entirely dependent on a retail landscape that was about to be violently torn apart. The tragedy of Murphy Radio is that the very architecture of its success became the instrument of its downfall. The uncompromising engineering, the massive Welwyn Garden City factory, and the fiercely independent high street dealer network had made the company invincible in the age of the valve radio. But as the 1950s drew to a close, the British domestic market began to fracture. The decline of this once dominant empire was not caused by a sudden drop in engineering quality. It was a structural collapse driven primarily by Force 5, a profound technological, retail, and listening culture shift, and Force 3, crushing high-street retail, rental chains, and price pressure. The first crack in the Welwyn Garden City fortress was a fundamental shift in the geometry of the British home. Throughout the 1930s and 1940s, the wireless set had been the undisputed centerpiece of the sitting room. It commanded space, attention, and a premium price. But by the late 1950s, the television set had aggressively usurped that central position. The radio was physically demoted. It was moved to the kitchen windowsill, the bedside table, the teenager's bedroom, or the garden shed. This displacement triggered a technological demand that Murphy was ill-equipped to dominate. The market shifted from the heavy, mains-powered valve radio to the transistor radio, a portable radio that uses small semiconductor devices instead of valves, making it lighter, cooler, and entirely battery-friendly. A transistor radio did not require a massive acoustic baffleboard. It did not require an expertly crafted walnut veneer cabinet to absorb the heat of glowing glass valves. It was a machine of plastic, printed circuit boards, and minimal weight. Murphy engineers certainly knew how to design a transistor circuit, but their entire corporate philosophy, no-nonsense, heavy-duty, repairable engineering, was suddenly at odds with a listening culture that increasingly viewed the radio as a casual, semi-disposable convenience. A teenager wanting to listen to pop music under the bed covers did not care about the longevity of the tuning capacitor. They only cared about the price and the size. Simultaneously, Force 3, the transformation of high street retail, began to choke the company's revenue. For decades, the exclusive Murphy dealer system had been a stroke of commercial genius. By restricting supply, Murphy guaranteed high margins and absolute brand loyalty. But this system only worked when the public was willing to make a dedicated trip to a specialist shop and pay a fixed premium for a single wooden cabinet. By the dawn of the 1960s, the British high street was becoming an arena of ruthless volume. The rise of radio rentals, a massive business model where customers rented radio and television equipment rather than buying it outright, radically altered how households acquired electronics. Families who previously would have saved up to buy a Murphy radiogram were now walking into a rental showroom to lease a television, often taking a cheap, mass-produced radio on a combined rental ticket. Furthermore, General Electrical retailers and department stores were flooding their windows with more affordable sets from competitors like Pi, Bush, and imported brands. Because Murphy stubbornly refused to sell through these general wholesalers, they were entirely locked out of the rapidly expanding mass market. The local Murphy dealer, once the proud gatekeeper of British audio quality, suddenly found themselves dangerously isolated. Operating a shop that only sold one brand became an economic liability. Many dealers began quietly breaking their contracts, hiding cheaper, faster-selling transistor radios from rival manufacturers in their back rooms just to keep their businesses afloat. When the dealer network began to fray, Welwyn Garden City lost its protective moat. The financial pressure on the Broadwater Road factory became immense. Force One, British cabinet, transistor, component, labor, and manufacturing costs caught up with the company. Maintaining a massive domestic manufacturing plant that wound its own transformers and built highly complex television and radio chassis required enormous economies of scale. As sales volumes dipped because they were locked out of the discount high street, the cost of producing each Murphy set skyrocketed. They could not simply lower the price without bankrupting the factory, and they could not compromise the engineering without destroying the very meaning of the Murphy name. The company found itself trapped in an impossible paradox. They were building machines designed to last a lifetime for a market that was already looking toward the next disposable trend. By 1961, the independent spirit that Frank Murphy had instilled was failing to balance the ledger. The company was overextended, heavily burdened by the immense capital required to develop color television, and watching its traditional radio market shrink month by month. The Welwyn Garden City empire was bleeding money, and the board of directors realized that isolation on the high street was no longer a strength. It was a death sentence. They needed capital, they needed mass distribution, and they needed it immediately. The stage was set for one of the most abrupt and culturally devastating corporate absorptions in British electronics history. In 1962, the final collapse of Murphy's independence arrived not from a foreign electronics competitor, but from a massive British entertainment conglomerate. The Rank Organization, a corporate titan best known for its cinemas and film studios, purchased the financially exhausted Welwyn Garden City Company. Rank already owned Bush Radio, which was historically Murphy's fiercest rival on the British high street. In a ruthless stroke of corporate consolidation, the two proudly distinct companies were forcibly smashed together to form a new, monolithic entity, Rank Bush Murphy. For the loyal engineers working on Broadwater Road, this merger was a philosophical catastrophe. The entire premise of Murphy Radio had been built on uncompromising, unique receiver design. But the Rank Organization was not interested in esoteric, expensive engineering. They were interested in economies of scale. Almost immediately, the systematic dismantling of the Murphy identity began. The first major casualty of the merger was the physical product itself. To drastically cut manufacturing costs, the new corporate parent initiated a process of aggressive platform sharing. The heavy, acoustically perfect wooden baffle boards and the distinct, highly selective chassis layouts that Welwyn Garden City was famous for were rapidly phased out. In their place came standardized, mass-produced printed circuit boards, boards carrying electronic components and copper tracks that connect them, that were shared universally across multiple brands. Within a few short years, a Murphy portable radio, a radio designed to be moved from room to room or taken outdoors, was internally identical to a Bush radio. The only difference was the plastic badge glued to the front grille. The honest engineering that Frank Murphy and E.J. Power had passionately championed had been replaced by cynical brand dilution. A name that had once guaranteed elite performance now meant absolutely nothing about the circuitry inside the box. The second, and perhaps most culturally devastating casualty, was the High Street. The rank organization had no patience for the elite, restricted Murphy dealer network. They wanted sheer retail volume. The exclusive postcode monopolies that had protected local shopkeepers for decades were systematically revoked. The strict corporate requirements for in-house service counters and highly qualified repair engineers were entirely abandoned. Murphy sets were suddenly pushed into general electrical retailers, discount catalogs, supermarket shelves, and massive rental chains, forced to sit alongside dozens of cheaper competitors. For the British listener, the magic and trust of the brand evaporated instantly. When a family walked into a generic shop in 1968 and bought a Murphy transistor radio, they were no longer entering an ecosystem of guaranteed reception. They were just buying a generic plastic box. If the tuning dial, the scale or display that shows which station or frequency the radio is tuned to, snapped, or if the cheap internal ferrite rod aerial failed, there was no longer a local expert waiting to fix it. The radio was simply thrown into the bin and replaced. The deeply ingrained British culture of repair had been fundamentally defeated by a new imported culture of replacement. This acceleration was worsened by Force 4, imports, private labels, and good enough listening. As the 1970s progressed, the British domestic electronics industry was besieged by highly efficient, extremely cheap Japanese transistor radios and Hong Kong imports. These foreign sets were smaller, frequently more reliable, and aggressively priced. To compete, Rank Bush Murphy moved production further down market, permanently abandoning the premium tier that Murphy had once dominated. Throughout the 1970s, the vast Welwyn Garden City facilities were gradually downgraded, stripped of their autonomy, and eventually shut down entirely. The skilled British labor force, the men and women who had meticulously wound the heavy transformers for the indestructible naval receivers and polished the sweeping walnut cabinets for the sitting room radiograms, were laid off or dispersed. Production was moved to other Rank factories, and eventually, the manufacturing of sets bearing the Murphy name was outsourced overseas to global supply chains. By the 1980s, the name Murphy was kept alive only as an artificial marketing ghost. The badge was licensed out to appear on cheap imported televisions, low-budget portable cassette players, and generic clock radios, small radios combined with an alarm clock, often used beside a bed. The brilliant Welwyn Garden City engineers who had originally built the brand's formidable reputation would not have recognized the cheap plastic devices bearing their name. The original promise was entirely hollow. The modern market had demanded cheaper, disposable, generic electronics, and the corporate parent had obliged, systematically stripping the Welwyn Garden City name of everything that had once made it essential to the British home. The system of trust was completely dismantled. The exclusive contracts were torn up. The local service counters closed. The heavy wooden cabinets vanished. The Welwyn Garden City lines stopped. The vast factory floor fell silent. The trusted badge became a sticker. The radio became completely disposable. Today, the Murphy badge no longer commands space in a British high street shop window. After the final collapse of domestic manufacturing under the Rank organization, the name drifted into complete corporate obscurity. It briefly lingered as a licensed trademark in the 1980s and 1990s, cynically slapped onto imported televisions, cheap plastic alarm clocks, and generic battery-powered transistor radios, portable radios using small semiconductor devices rather than glass valves. Eventually, even this ghostly afterlife faded away. The uncompromising corporate entity that Frank Murphy and E.J. Power founded in 1929 ceased to exist in any meaningful electronic capacity. If you visit Welwyn Garden City today and walk down Broadwater Road, You will not find the sprawling temple of British electronics that once dictated national audio standards. The massive factory floor, where thousands of local men and women meticulously soldered printed circuit boards and aligned heavy tuning capacitors, the components that change a circuit's tuning to select a specific station, has been entirely erased. The brickwork, the research laboratories, and the busy loading bays have been demolished. In their place stand modern office blocks, retail parks, and residential flats. There is no sound of machinery. There is no scent of warm wood veneer. The physical footprint of one of Britain's most fiercely independent engineering empires has been swept away by modern urban regeneration. Yet, the true legacy of Murphy Radio did not die in a corporate boardroom, and it was not buried under a commercial property development. It survived exactly where it began, on the repair bench. Across Britain today, there is a thriving, deeply dedicated secondary market for original Welwyn Garden City wireless sets. On eBay, on Gumtree, and at the bustling weekend swap meets organized by the British Vintage Wireless Society, a pre-1962 Murphy Radio remains a highly respected prize. Vintage radio collectors and amateur electronics enthusiasts actively hunt for the severe, modernist A-series table radios from the 1930s, and the striking post-war baffleboard models. The radios featuring a large, flat wooden panel surrounding the loudspeaker to prevent sound waves from canceling each other out. They seek them out for the exact same reason the local high street service engineers praised them 80 years ago. A Murphy valve radio, a set relying on glowing glass electronic devices to amplify broadcast signals, was fundamentally built to be repaired, not replaced. When a modern collector places an 80-year-old Murphy chassis onto a brightly lit service bench, they find brilliantly logical wiring, highly accessible test points, and over-engineered transformers that have survived decades of intense heat. To restore a Murphy is to engage in a conversation with an engineer who respected the machine and respected the person fixing it. But the most astonishing footnote in the Murphy story does not sit quietly in a domestic sitting room. It sits in the busy workshops of serious amateur radio operators, maritime listeners, and naval historians. The legendary Murphy B40 naval receiver, the massive cast-alloy communications receiver built for the Royal Navy to intercept distant signals on short wave, a broadcast band that carries signals across oceans and continents, refused to become obsolete. Decades after the Welwyn Garden City factory closed, and long after the Rank organization stripped the brand of its high street dignity, these 100-pound metal beasts are still actively powered on. They survived the brutal, corrosive damp of the North Atlantic. They survived the long tensions of the Cold War. And they survived the collapse of their own creator. Today, with a cleaned tuning dial and a fresh set of valves, a B40 will still lock onto a faint Morse code transmission from across the globe with terrifying, absolute precision. It is the ultimate, undeniable vindication of the no-nonsense philosophy. What does the rise and fall of Murphy Radio reveal about the British listening market? It exposes the harsh, inevitable gap between what a culture claims to value and what the retail market actually rewards. The British public genuinely admired honest engineering. They trusted the local, independent high street dealer who could install an aerial, the wire that catches radio waves from the air, and repair a fault on the same day. They appreciated a wooden cabinet that did not lie to them by pretending to be a fake Tudor antique. But when the structural forces of cheap imported electronics, discount retail chains, and changing listening habits arrived, that quiet admiration was simply not enough to save the Welwyn Garden City factory. The market demanded cheap convenience over heavy longevity. Today, British audio is dominated by the smart speaker, a connected device that plays music through voice commands without a physical tuning scale, and internet radio, where digital data replaces broadcast waves entirely. The modern listener demands a device that is cheap enough to throw away rather than heavy enough to repair. Murphy Radio failed the modern era precisely because it refused to compromise its original design language. They built heavy, complex machines meant to last a lifetime, but the retail industry only wanted a season. Yet, the machines outlived the market logic. Somewhere in a British sitting room, a heavy Murphy valve radio still commands the corner of a polished wooden sideboard. The severe, unadorned cabinet smells faintly of old wax and warm dust. The heavy glass valves glow steadily in the dark. The beautifully clear tuning dial waits silently behind its protective glass cover, and the massive internal loudspeaker sits perfectly still, waiting for a hand to turn the precision knob and pull one more trusted voice from the air. See you in the next video.